Many people believe in God, but what would you say if I told you that their model of God is wrong? This is not a small issue. It directly challenges the core attributes of God, not just minor details, so it cannot be ignored. In the name of God, the Great and the Merciful, hello everyone and welcome. I am truly happy to be with you here with a topic that is deep, meaningful, and highly impactful on the path toward clarifying truth. In this video, we intend to address one of the most important challenges in belief systems, the incorrect model of God. A model in which God is completely separate from His creation. This is a model that has been widely accepted in religions, especially in the Abrahamic religions, such as Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. But here is a very important point. This critique does not come from an atheist. Rather, it comes from someone who knows there is a God, rather than merely believing in His existence. Someone who presents modern, contemporary arguments and proofs for the correct model of the divine. This point matters, because usually, when a critique of religion or the concept of God comes from an atheist, many religious people quickly take a defensive position. They assume that since the critique denies God, then they must have bad intentions and are only trying to destroy belief. But this discussion is not like that at all. In fact, it is presented in the direction of achieving a better and more complete understanding of God. Some of these arguments are those that have been raised before, while others are modern insights that you will likely only encounter here. Now, the roadmap of this discussion. In this discussion, our path is completely clear. First, we will precisely define the models of a God separate from creation. Then we will logically and firmly reject each of them. And finally, we will briefly refer to the correct model of God. So, this is not a one-sided critique. At the same time, we will also present an alternative path and the correct model. Defining the problem, a God separate from creation. The model that is the subject of our critique is one in which God is the creator of the universe, but is separate from it. Within this framework, two main models can be imagined: the Watchmaker God and the Sun-and-radiance model. Please pay close attention. Up to this point, no other clear and understandable model has been presented beside these two, and naturally, any model of God that is separate from creation, but vague and unclear, is automatically rejected and does not even enter the scope of our discussion. First model, the Watchmaker God. In this model, God is like a watchmaker. He creates the universe, and then that universe, separate from God, continues its existence. This model has two possible forms. Either God does not intervene in the universe, or He does intervene. But in both cases, serious problems exist that make this model invalid. First problem: violation of absolute perfection. If the universe exists outside of God, then God can no longer be considered absolutely perfect. Why? Because something exists outside of Him that He does not encompass. If even the smallest thing exists outside of God, then the attribution of absolute perfection can no longer be applied to Him. Some people say, because God was able to create the universe, He is perfect from our perspective. And they argue that perfection does not necessarily mean encompassing everything. From this viewpoint, God's superiority over the universe makes Him perfect. But this argument is not sufficient, because God must be absolutely perfect, not just relatively superior. Let us clarify this with an example. Imagine a car company that produces and sells cars in two situations. As long as the cars remain within the company, we can say the company has absolute ownership over them. But once a car is sold, the company is no longer its owner, and it drops from the level of absolute ownership. It is true that the company produced those cars and can produce more again. This means the company has superiority, but even by selling and transferring just one car to someone else, it no longer has absolute ownership. Now consider a second situation. Imagine that all people in the world are employees of that same company, and the cars are only bought and sold among them as long as they work for the company. In this case, the company still remains the absolute owner, because although the employees has bought the car, the employee himself is still, in a sense, under the company. Now the question is, in the Watchmaker model, the universe is created and then exists outside of God. So how can God still remain the absolute ruler, the absolute owner, and absolutely perfect? As a seeker of truth, which one would you consider God? A being with relative ownership and relative perfection, like the company that sells its cars to outsiders? Or a being with absolute ownership and absolute perfection, like the second scenario in our example? Second problem, the violation of absolute independence. If God does not intervene in the universe, then why should we worship Him? Because He has completely left us on our own, and we and our universe move forward by themselves without any role from God, so God's attribute of being worthy of worship is undermined. But if He does intervene, then He needs the universe in order to exercise His will, to reward or to punish. In that case, His absolute independence is questioned. Because if, for example, He leaves the universe alone and it moves toward destruction, then His wisdom is questioned. Why create a world that eventually collapses? Or if He does not respond to injustice, then His justice is questioned. And many similar issues arise. So in order to remain a God with those perfect attributes, He must intervene in this universe. When we say God is absolutely independent, we mean two things. First, for His existence and continuity, He lacks nothing, so He remains eternal. Second, in order to remain an eternal God with all His perfect attributes intact, He does not receive even the smallest thing from anything outside Himself, and He has absolutely no dependency. But in the Watchmaker model, whether God intervenes or not, in both cases, He loses one or more of His perfect attributes. And this means that this model cannot represent the one true God. Second model, the sun and its radiation. In this model, God is like the sun, and the universe is like the light and heat that radiates from it. Although this model contains some elements of truth, it still faces serious problems and is ultimately incorrect. First problem, what is the fate of the universe? How far do these radiations continue? Do they have an end? If they have an end, what stops them? If God stops them, then His absolute independence is once again violated, because He would have to exercise His will over something outside of Himself in order to give His creation a meaningful end and avoid being judged as having created without wisdom. If something other than God stops them and determines their fate, then we must ask, what being has the power to do this to God's creation? Does God have a partner? Then what happens to God's unity? If the universe continues infinitely, like light rays, then we must ask, would a wise God assign such a completely unclear ending for His creation, one that moves toward nothingness? Second problem, value and meaning of the universe. Do these radiations, meaning the universe and its beings, have value and meaning? If we say that God's creation has no value or meaning, then we are declaring ourselves worthless. In that case, why should we seek God? Why should an aware God want worthless beings to know Him and worship Him? On the other hand, how could a worthless being grow and progress so much over time and discover and create meaning for itself? And more importantly, how could a transcendent God create a worthless creation? So this scenario cannot be correct. Now, If we and the universe have value, which we do, then this value must have been given to us by God, because God has no partner who could have given anything to us. So the main question is this: is God losing something from himself and giving it to us? If that is the case, then God before creation is different from God after creation. But we know that no change occurs in the essence of God. In nature, the sun radiates and burns until it eventually goes out. Is God the same? If yes, then he is not eternal. If no, then where does this endless energy, this meaning and value, come from? Is God dependent on a source outside himself? If so, his absolute independence is again questioned. And if not, does this meaning and value, which is a form of existence, come from nothing, so that God gives it to us and it still remains eternal? But we clearly know that existence cannot come from nothing. Summary of the critiques. As we have clearly seen, even with this level of explanation, both models of a God separate from creation lead to serious contradictions in God's attributes. And we know that if even one attribute of God is violated, then what we are focusing on is not the true God, but a false concept. And this false concept becomes the source of many deviations, incorrect beliefs, and harmful conclusions. But let us also briefly address the idea of creation from nothing, creation ex nihilo. Many scholars in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism believe that God did not create the universe from his own essence, as in the sun model, nor from pre-existing matter, as in the Watchmaker model. Instead, they say that God created the universe from nothing. At first glance, it may seem that this idea challenges the arguments we presented, but it does not. Let me explain this very briefly. Are we and our universe real, or are we just an illusion? If creation from nothing means that our foundation is illusion or non-existence, then everything collapses, because we know that we exist, and it is this awareness of existence that drives us to explore and understand our world. But if we do exist, and God created us from nothing, then where did our existence come from? Existence does not come from non-existence. So the only logical conclusion is this: God created us with his own being. And in that case, creation is not separate from God. It exists within him. And this is exactly the model that we consider to be correct and complete. On the other hand, some argue that the universe is like a shadow of God, and that a shadow compared to its source is nothing. But we must ask, would a wise God send so many prophets for something that is nothing? Would he create heaven and hell? Would he respond to prayers? Is this how an all-aware and wise God should act? So which one should we accept? That God is not wise, or that the universe is not merely a shadow? Even though this is only part of the argument against this view, it is, in my opinion, enough to make the issue clear. Now, the correct model of God. The correct model of God, briefly, is this: God is existence itself, not a being separate from it. Ultimate existence, with all divine attributes, eternity, absolute power, absolute awareness, absolute independence, absolute goodness, and more. This model will be fully explained in its proper place, and you will clearly see that God is indeed the totality of existence. Even the major criticism directed at this model, such as reducing God to existence, nature, or the problem of evil, all have very deep and beautiful answers that do not contradict any divine attributes. It is important to mention that our model is not simply a repetition of Spinoza's concept of God, nor the traditional idea of pantheism. Rather, it is a refined model that offers a much deeper and more solid understanding. In fact, a significant part of this explanation is entirely new. and has not been presented in this way before. So we will explain the correct model of God in its proper section. But for now, let me invite you, my dear religious friends, to a moment of reflection. If you are truly a seeker of truth, it does not matter whether you are Muslim, Christian, or Jewish. Take these questions seriously. If answers exist, present them. Although I am confident that no such answers exist, I still invite you to search. Ask the scholars of your own religion and see whether they can provide clear and strong answers. I am fully prepared to answer questions and respond to critiques, and I genuinely welcome them. In the end, let me briefly clarify another important point. When we say that the model of a God separate from creation is invalid, it does not mean that major religions like Islam, Christianity, and Judaism are fundamentally false. Rather, it means that there has been a misunderstanding in the interpretation of their texts and teachings. A misunderstanding that, especially in the present time, has revealed clear contradictions and problems. So our goal is not to reject religion at its core, nor to deny the existence of God. Our goal is to present the correct model of God.